All right, ready to dive into another fascinating chapter of history.
Absolutely. Always up for a good deep dive.
This time we're tackling the Russian Revolution, and I have to say, this textbook chapter you shared, Socialism in Europe and the Russian Revolution, it's full of these first-hand accounts, really puts you right there in the thick of it.
It's something that always strikes me about this period, how these massive, social and political upheavals, they were driven by the everyday realities of ordinary Russians.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the big names, the ideologies, but
Exactly, but the Russian Revolution, it was deeply rooted in those struggles of workers, peasants, everyday people just trying to get by.
makes you wonder, what was life actually like for these people, early 20th century Russia?
Well, imagine this, an empire kind of teetering on the edge of modernity, right? You have these vast stretches of land still ruled by centuries-old traditions, but at the same time, you have this rapid rise of industry, these industrial centers popping up. So you have this jarring contrast, old world, new world.
And that contrast wasn't just geographical, right? I mean, it seems like Russia was this melting pot of social classes all kind of on this collision course.
Exactly. You had the czar and the nobility at the top clinging to power and privilege, right? Then you have millions of peasants struggling to survive in a system that offered very little opportunity for advancement.
And then into this mix, you have the growing industrial working class.
Exactly. Farmers, families, drawn to the cities by the promise of factory work, but often finding themselves caught in a different kind of struggle.
It's like all the ingredients for revolution were baked right into the fabric of society.
Yeah, and what's interesting is how this tension is reflected in the way some socialist thinkers viewed the peasantry, for example. Like in the French Revolution, peasants largely supported the monarchy,
Interesting.
right? But in Russia, peasants, they had long resented the czar. The nobility saw them as the source of their hardship.
So it created this very different dynamic.
Absolutely. It created fertile ground for these socialist ideas to take root.
Which leads us to the various socialist movements gaining traction at the time. Your source mentions the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. What were their core beliefs and what set them apart?
So both groups ultimately wanted to overthrow the czarist regime, right? Establish a socialist society, but they differed significantly in their approach. The Mensheviks, they believed in a more gradual path towards socialism, advocating for a mass-based party, one that would work within the existing political system to bring about change.
So a more reformist approach.
Exactly. Now, the Bolsheviks, under Lenin, completely different story. They believed in a much more disciplined, hierarchical party structure. They advocated for a swift, decisive seizure of power.
So a much more revolutionary approach.
Absolutely. They argued that Russia, given its specific social and economic conditions, was ripe for a revolution led by what they call a vanguard party.
A vanguard party means.
Meaning they saw themselves as this, leading the charge, even if it meant challenging the existing order, even within the socialist movement itself.
Interesting. And this difference in strategy, this difference in ideology, it's going to become incredibly significant as the revolution unfolds.
Absolutely.
Now, you mentioned earlier that this revolution, it wasn't just fueled by these abstract ideals. Your source really dives into the very real problems that were pushing ordinary Russians to the breaking point.
Yeah, and leading up to 1905, you have this perfect storm brewing in Russia. Economic hardship, social unrest. Industrialization, while it brought some progress, also led to terrible working conditions, low wages, widespread poverty. The peasantry, despite the emancipation of the serfs decades earlier, still largely trapped in this cycle of poverty, landlessness.
Right, because freeing the serfs doesn't necessarily solve the underlying economic issues.
Exactly. And then you add on top of all that a series of bad harvests, food shortages, prices skyrocketing.
It's a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely.
And amidst all of this, we see these fascinating glimpses into daily life. There's this one story, workers in St. Petersburg, they're organizing these secret socialist meetings right under the noses of their bosses.
Wow.
They would form human plugs in doorways if the police came just to buy time. It speaks to how, even in these really oppressive circumstances, people found ways to resist.
It's incredible, the length they would go to. And all this simmering discontent, it finally boiled over in 1905. And the thing that really ignited the 1905 revolution, it wasn't so exactly in what started as this small, localized protest, it just snowballed.
Fueled by, like you said, years of pent-up frustration with the regime.
Yeah, years of it, and became this nationwide movement, and then you have Bloody Sunday.
Which the textbook describes as this just horrifying event.
It really is.
A peaceful demonstration descends into chaos when Tsarist troops open fire on unarmed workers.
Even people carrying religious icons,
It's this really stark image, you know?
It shows how brutal the regime was, how out of touch the Tsar was with his own people.
It really shattered that illusion of the Tsar as this, like, benevolent father figure, right?
Completely, yeah. And it ignited this wave of strikes and protests across the country. And the 1905 revolution, it ultimately failed to achieve its main goals, but it had a huge impact.
From your reading of the source, what were some of the lasting impacts of this first revolution?
Well, it forced the Tsar to make some concessions. Like, he agreed to create the Duma,
Which was?
Russia's first parliament.
Okay.
The idea was to give the people a voice in the government.
Yeah.
But the Tsar, he still held most of the power. He could dissolve the Duma whenever he wanted. So it became pretty clear he wasn't actually interested in meaningful democratic reform.
So it was a case of too little, too late?
Yeah, pretty much. The 1905 revolution, it didn't get rid of the Tsar, but it definitely radicalized a lot of people, especially within the socialist movements.
Right, because it showed that the system wasn't going to change on its own.
Exactly, yeah. It showed how weak the Tsarist regime really was. And it fueled this growing belief that real change, lasting change, would only come through revolution.
And all of this is happening against the backdrop of, global conflict, World War I. How did that play into all of this? How did it affect the situation in Russia?
World War I was a disaster for Russia. Militarily and socially, just a complete disaster.
The source really emphasizes how devastating the war was, especially for ordinary Russians.
Yeah, and you have to imagine millions of soldiers, many of them peasants, who were pulled off their farms, thrown into these trenches with hardly any equipment. Terrible leadership.
Yeah, we read about families starving, mothers grieving for their sons.
Soldiers deserting in droves, just trying to get back home.
It just seems like everything was falling apart.
It was. The war just shattered their economy, which was already fragile, led to these massive shortages of food, fuel, just basic necessities.
And on top of all that, the Tsar decides to personally lead the army.
Which backfired spectacularly.
Right, because then every single loss, every setback is directly tied to him.
Exactly. So by 1917, Russia is just on the verge of collapse.
And that is when the Tsar's grip on power finally slips, the February Revolution.
Right.
And your source has this really fascinating description of this period.
It is a fascinating period.
What's striking is how spontaneous it was. It wasn't like a planned coup or anything.
It really wasn't. It was more like this culmination of events. Things just spiraled out of control.
And it starts with bread riots in Petrograd.
Literally, bread riots.
And it wasn't like these seasoned revolutionaries leading the charge. It was everyday people.
Just ordinary people who were fed up. They were hungry. They were desperate.
Mothers, factory workers.
Soldiers even.
And it's happening during International Women's Day, which just adds this whole other layer to it.
It's remarkable. Yeah, it was supposed to be this day celebrating women's rights. And instead, women are out there leading demonstrations, demanding bread, demanding peace, demanding an end to the war.
And it's this outpouring of, frustration and anger that ultimately forces the Tsar to abdicate.
It does, yeah. It creates this power vacuum.
And ushers in a whole new phase of revolution.
A very chaotic phase. You have the provisional government trying to establish this more democratic system, but they're struggling to maintain order. And they're getting pressure from all sides.
Who?
Well, you have the workers' councils, the Soviets, demanding these radical social and economic reforms.
Right.
And then you have the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, seeing this as their chance to seize power.
And Lenin himself, he had been in exile, right?
Exile in Switzerland.
But he returns to Russia with this really bold vision for the country.
He did, yeah. Lays it all out in his April theses.
Which called for
an end to the war, land redistribution, worker control of factories. It was a blueprint for a socialist revolution.
And those ideas, they weren't exactly mainstream at the time?
No, even within socialist circles, they were considered pretty radical. But after years of war, deprivation, they resonated with people.
Because these weren't just abstract ideas anymore, were they?
Exactly. They were tangible solutions to the very real problems people were facing.
It's like the war, the revolution, it all created this perfect storm for someone like Lenin to step in.
Yeah, absolutely. And he wasn't alone. Trotsky.
Right, Leon Trotsky.
Brilliant orator, strategist. He joined forces with Lenin.
And played a key role in drumming up support for the Bolsheviks.
Huge role, yeah, especially among the workers and soldiers in Petrograd.
So now we have the stage set. You have the provisional government clinging to power, but becoming more and more unpopular by the day.
Right.
And you have the Bolsheviks waiting in the wings with their, radical vision, their growing base of support, and the country is just
Okay.
more than on edge. It feels like it's teetering on the brink.
Yeah, and the question wasn't if there would be another revolution, but when.
And it did erupt, didn't it? The October Revolution. I mean, this is a
Yeah.
turning point, not just in Russian history, but in world history.
It really is. And it's fascinating because in a lot of ways, it was a revolution within a revolution. Well, the February Revolution, that got rid of the Tsar, brought down the monarchy. But October, that was about who would shape Russia's future.
Right, so it's almost like round two.
Exactly. Would it be this more moderate provisional government? Or would it be Lenin and the Bolsheviks with their vision of a socialist state?
And the Bolsheviks, I mean, they were a relatively small group at this point, but they managed to pull it off. What were the key factors in their success?
Well, for one thing, they were incredibly strategic. Under Trotsky's leadership, they focused on taking control of these really key institutions in Petrograd: the telegraph, the post office, government buildings.
So they wanted to control the flow of information, basically.
Exactly. And they also made sure they had the support of the city's garrison. So they had the military power to back up their claims.
So it was a combination of like strategic planning and effective propaganda.
Exactly. But there's another thing, and I think this is often overlooked. The Bolsheviks were really good at capitalizing on the provisional government's mistakes. Because remember, Russia was still fighting World War I.
Which, by that point, nobody wanted to be
Or
fighting.
nobody. And the provisional government, they decided to keep the war going, which just alienated huge chunks of the population.
Especially the soldiers and their families who were just desperate for this to be over.
Exactly. And Lenin, he saw that and he used it. Peace, land, bread.
Right, their slogan.
It was brilliant. End the war, give the land to the peasants, fix the economy. It resonated with people because it spoke to their needs, their desires.
Yeah.
And it made the Bolsheviks look like the only ones who could actually deliver.
And deliver, they did. Your source talks about these really sweeping changes the Bolsheviks made once they were in power.
Yeah, they moved quickly.
Like, how quickly are we talking?
As soon as they took over, they started nationalizing banks, putting industries under state control. And of course, they abolished private land ownership.
Wow. I mean, these weren't just tweaks to the system. This was a complete overhaul.
It was. They were completely reshaping Russian society and the economy, too. It's hard to imagine what that must have been like for ordinary people caught in the middle of it all.
Right. Like, on the one hand, you have this sense of possibility, of hope.
Absolutely.
But on the other hand, there's this incredible upheaval, this uncertainty.
Yeah, and all of this is happening while a brutal civil war is raging.
Right, because it wasn't like everyone was just on board with this new Bolshevik government.
No, not at all. You had the whites, this coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces fighting to take back the country.
And the source doesn't shy away from the brutality of this period. The violence, the famine, the suffering.
It was a tragedy for everyone involved.
Yeah.
Millions of people died.
Mhm.
And it's just this stark reminder that revolutions, even those driven by the best of intentions, often come at a very, very high price.
And for the Bolsheviks, once they won the Civil War, they were faced with this monumental task, actually building a socialist state from the ground up. And one of the most ambitious and controversial things they tried was collectivization. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So collectivization, that was a key part of Stalin's plan to modernize Soviet agriculture. Basically, they wanted to consolidate all these small individual peasant farms into these big collectively owned farms called kolkhozes. The idea was these bigger farms would be more efficient, more productive, they'd have modern machinery.
It makes sense on paper.
Right, the goal was to boost agricultural production, solve the food shortages.
But I'm guessing it didn't exactly go according to plan.
No, it didn't. You have to remember, for generations, these peasants had worked their own land. It was their livelihood, their heritage. And now they're being told to give all that up, work for the state.
And that didn't go over well.
It didn't. A lot of peasants resisted, and the collectivization was often implemented really brutally.
The source mentions these peasants labeled kulaks.
Right, they were seen as enemies of the state, accused of being wealthy peasants hoarding grain.
Which often wasn't even true.
No, but the label was used to justify taking their land, deporting them, sometimes even executing them. And you have these heartbreaking letters from peasants begging for help, for someone to recognize what's happening.
It's hard to even imagine the scale of the suffering.
It was immense. The disruption from collectivization, combined with these unrealistic grain quotas the government imposed, it led to widespread famine.
The Holodomor in Ukraine.
Exactly. Millions of people died. And it's important to remember, this climate of fear, this repression, it wasn't just limited to the countryside.
Right, you have the purges, the show trials.
Exactly. Stalin's paranoia and brutality, it touched every part of Soviet society. Anyone perceived as a threat, even within the Communist Party itself, could be targeted. Writers, artists, scientists, military leaders, nobody was safe.
And the show trials, those were just so chilling. These elaborate spectacles, forcing people to confess to crimes they didn't commit.
All orchestrated to solidify Stalin's grip on power.
It really makes you think about the nature of power, how even revolutions that start with these ideals of equality and freedom can become so twisted.
It's a cautionary tale, that's for sure.
So with all of this happening, what was the rest of the world making of the Russian Revolution?
Well, it captured the imagination of people all over the world, especially in colonized countries.
Because they saw it as a blueprint for their own revolutions.
In a way, yes. The idea that a small group of revolutionaries could overthrow a powerful empire, that workers and peasants could take control, it was incredibly powerful.
And you shared those accounts from Indian intellectuals who traveled to the Soviet Union during this period.
Yeah, figures like M.N. Roy, Rabindranath Tagore.
What were their impressions?
Well, they were drawn to this idea of a more just, equitable society, and they did see progress. The Soviets were making strides in education, healthcare, industrial development, but they also saw the other side of it, the suppression of dissent, the forced collectivization, the fear. It's a reminder that even those who supported the ideals of the Russian Revolution, they often struggled with the realities of what was happening on the ground.
It's such a complex, multifaceted event, and it's left such a complicated legacy.
It has. And I think that's what makes it so important to study to understand, because it raises these really big questions about power, about social change, about the promises and the perils of revolution, questions that we're still grappling with today.
So as we look back at the Russian Revolution more than a century later, what are the key takeaways you hope listeners will take from this deep dive?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that the Russian Revolution was a pivotal moment in history, not just for Russia, but for the world. It showed that ordinary people, even in the most oppressive circumstances, can rise up and demand change. But it also showed us how difficult, how messy, how dangerous that process can be. And it's a reminder that the fight for a more just, more equitable world, it's an ongoing struggle, one that requires constant vigilance, critical thinking, and a willingness to learn from the past.
Absolutely. And on that note, I want to thank you, the listeners, for joining us on this deep dive into the Russian Revolution. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of history's biggest questions